Please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
As India celebrates its 72nd Independence Day, Prime Minister Modi delivering his 5th Independence Day speech from the ramparts of the Red Fort, setting the tone for Battle 2019. In what is his last speech ahead of next year's Lok Sabha elections, the Prime Minister focusing on the economic agenda of the government. Very quickly, for those of you who might not have seen the speech, let me take you through the highlights of the Prime Minister's address. Going back to the tenure of the UPA, once again the comparison between policy paralysis and decisive decision-making. The Prime Minister saying the government's performance should be judged on the basis of speed at which the economy has been transformed since he came to office in 2014. Also adding that before 2014, India was seen as part of the fragile 5 economies, and today organizations like the IMF call India an economy that is almost like an elephant which has started to run. That analogy being repeated once again. Speaking of the economic reforms undertaken by the NDA government, the Prime Minister spoke about the GST rollout, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and steps taken to tackle Benami properties. It was interesting to see that while the Prime Minister spoke of the battle against corruption, there was no mention of demonetization. The Prime Minister also highlighted the fact that in the last 4 years, the government has weeded out around 6 crore fake beneficiaries from various government schemes. The figure the Prime Minister claims has led to a savings of about 90,000 crore rupees. He also spoke of the government's focus on startups and self-employment, once again highlighting the scheme that is known as Mudra, saying that about 13 crore loans have been sanctioned under the Mudra program. In his message to farmers, the Prime Minister reiterating his commitment to double farm income by 2022 and said that the government was working towards an export policy for agri-products, also highlighting the government's decision on hiking MSP. The Prime Minister making a pitch to taxpayers for enabling the government to fund schemes, highlighting the fact that in the last 4 years of the NDA, the number of indirect taxpayers has almost doubled to about 7 crores. And after the GST rollout, the number of taxpayers has grown from 70 lakhs to 1 crore 16 lakhs. As we at CNBC-TV18 have been reporting, the Prime Minister launched the National Healthcare Scheme, which will now be called the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana and will cover 10 crore families. Initially, the tech testing for the scheme will begin immediately and it will be rolled out on the 25th of September. Highlights there of the Prime Minister's speech. Take a listen.
2014 के पहले दुनिया की गणमान्य संस्थाएं, दुनिया के गणमान्य अर्थशास्त्री, दुनिया में जिनकी बात को अधिकृत माना जाता है, ऐसे लोग कभी हमारे देश के लिए क्या कहा करते थे। वो भी एक जमाना था जब दुनिया से आवाज उठती थी, विद्वानों से आवाज उठती थी कि हिंदुस्तान की इकोनॉमी रिस्क भरी है, उनको रिस्क दिखाई देता था। लेकिन आज वही लोग, वही संस्थाएं, वही दोस्त बड़े विश्वास के साथ कह रही है कि रिफॉर्म मोमेंटम फंडामेंटल को मजबूती दे रहा है। कैसा बदलाव आ गया। वो भी दिन था जब विश्व मान करके बैठा था भारत यानी पॉलिसी पैरालिसिस, भारत यानी डिलेड रिफॉर्म्स। वो बात हम सुनते थे, आज भी अखबार निकाल के देखोगे तो दिखाई देगा। लेकिन आज दुनिया से एक ही बात आ रही है, रिफॉर्म, परफॉर्म, ट्रांसफॉर्म, एक के बाद एक नीति विषयक समयबद्ध निर्णयों के सिलसिला। वो भी एक वक्त था जब विश्व भारत को फ्रेजाइल 5 में गिनता था। दुनिया चिंतित थी कि दुनिया को डुबोने में भारत भी अपनी भूमिका अदा कर रहा है। फ्रेजाइल 5 में हमारी गिनती हो रही थी। लेकिन आज दुनिया कह रही है भारत मल्टी ट्रिलियन डॉलर के इन्वेस्टमेंट का डेस्टिनेशन बन गया है, मल्टी ट्रिलियन डॉलर के इन्वेस्टमेंट का डेस्टिनेशन बन गया है, वहीं से आवाज बदल गई है।
Well, highlights of the Prime Minister's speech. Joining us now to discuss the Prime Minister's speech, Shobhana Kamineni, the former president of CII and the executive vice chairperson of Apollo Hospitals, economist Rupa Subramanya, Avik Saha, national convener of the Jai Kisan Andolan, Sajid Chinoy of JP Morgan, and Ajay Srivastava, the CEO of Dimensions Corporate Finance Services. Rupa, Shobhana, and gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on the program. Shobhana Kamineni, let me start by asking you, because perhaps the single biggest announcement that came in through the Prime Minister's speech, which was a budget announcement, but today we now have a date on the actual implementation of the Ayushman Bharat scheme, which has now been rechristened the Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. In my conversation with Indu Bhushan, the CEO of the Ayushman Bharat program, what he said was that 28 states have now come on board. 8 states are still in the process of signing an MOU with the central government. Flexibility will be given to states to design the scheme as well on the packages themselves. That was a sore point. But what's interesting is that barely a handful of states have decided to go the route of private insurance. Most states have decided to adopt the trust model, which means that the centre and the state will take up the responsibility of the payment of claims. I want to get your thoughts on the Ayushman Bharat scheme and the opportunity it presents.
I think that today's speech was really, our Prime Minister owned it. Hugely inclusive, but coming down to Ayushman Bharat, huge opportunities in terms of serving the underserved, creating more jobs, and actually, giving healthcare to all. The initiative is laudable, and private healthcare now needs to play. We need to create more infrastructure. The specific question about trust versus the insurance model, both have been actually functioning. Most of RSBY, which was a central government scheme, was run through the through insurance, whereas many states use the trust model. The trust model actually puts a lot of burden on the states. As long as things are moving, it's okay. But we worry for the payer side, because at that point, in case the funds are stressed, so unless they create this big escrows, and there's a great mechanism in terms of fraud detection, and also the all the processes, the trust is definitely going to be something that the payers will, that the providers will watch very carefully as we move forward. But both models are actually tried and tested. I think that we're still so new in this. Health is still a state subject, so maybe that's a way of the states trying to keep control instead of ceding everything to the center. So both will work. Ultimately,
I
think that maybe more will move.
Sure, I agree with you on that. In fact, the government is hoping to take forward the Andhra Pradesh and the Telangana trust model, but it comes down to the bandwidth and the capacity of the state to actually be able to deliver, and you're absolutely right, that is going to be a crucial challenge. But Shobhana, the IMA had expressed serious reservations on the rates that had been announced by the government for the packages. Now the IMA has signed up and inked the MOU with the government, but package rates continue to be a cause for concern?
Definitely. See, speaking from Apollo, we want to support this scheme because it's really something that is a nation building and binding. But to do that, so we're offering 500 beds. So we said, let's do that at any cost. But what we fundamentally, that more private players will come on board if the government can actually separate Ayushman Bharat from business as usual, which is, providing great health care for the rest of the country. And I think that these two, so we should not cap rates. We should be able to do things that will allow hospitals to grow and continue to invest in Ayushman Bharat, because Ayushman Bharat requires investment. It requires investment in capacity building.
Yes.
In the tier 3, tier 4 cities and districts, but it also requires us to bring our costs down. So it's really going to be a tough challenge, but we want to be, most private players are on board.
Yes, now they are on board. The IMA has inked that MOU, and a degree of flexibility will be given to the state governments with a 10% ceiling on how much more the states can actually go when it comes to rates for packages. That's what Indu Bhushan, the CEO of the Ayushman Bharat, told me. But let me go across to Rupa. Rupa, I was talking about Ayushman Bharat, which was, the big announcement that the Prime Minister made, putting a date to the launch of that scheme, 25th of September. Earlier, the assumption was the 2nd of October. In terms of cost, my understanding is, because it's going to be a half-year rollout, 5,000 to 6,000 crore rupees. But outside of that, Rupa, what did you make of what the Prime Minister had to say when it comes to the reform agenda, the economic agenda? No big ticket, fresh announcements coming in. Perhaps that's a good thing. The markets would like the fact that there was that he's stuck to the path of perhaps fiscal consolidation, not making any announcements of new schemes, etc. On balance, how would you rate the Prime Minister's speech?
I thought it was, I wouldn't necessarily rate it very highly, but having said that, what was missing from his speech was the fact that he didn't really even announce any new reforms. So the markets may have been happy that he didn't announce any big ticket welfare schemes and just expanded on the announcement made in the budget on the Ayushman Bharat scheme. But in terms of actual reforms, the reform agenda, much needed reforms that are still hanging fire, he didn't actually speak to those reforms at all. In fact, the message was mostly focused on delivering development through social welfare, housing for all, sanitation for all, health for all,
yes,
and so on and so forth.
Water for all.
So as far as if you were looking for reforms from the Prime Minister's speech, there was absolutely nothing there addressing that. But if you were looking for social welfare, there was plenty.
Okay, let me go across to Sajid Chinoy. Sajid, as Rupa mentioned, that there was no clarity on, on the reform agenda going forward, but just on this question of the macros and the Prime Minister going back to the oft-repeated pitch that India was part of the Fragile Five. It no longer is. I know we've discussed this just 24 hours ago, that let's not obsess with where the rupee is at, and we shouldn't just focus on the 70 number. But, we've also had a trade deficit print come in yesterday, which doesn't look good at all. At a 5-year high, the trade deficit at over $18 billion. What does that now tell you in terms of where the current account deficit is likely to be? Could be as high as 3% if you extrapolate this number. And the vulnerabilities that the Prime Minister obviously would not address in this Independence Day speech, but one that policymakers will need to focus on.
Good morning, Shireen. I'm not surprised that there were no new big reforms, because we've maintained for a while now that this has to be the year of consolidation. This has to be the year of stabilization. We've taken on a lot already. We've got 2 big reforms that are underway. The GST is being stabilized. The asset resolution in the banking sector, which is, is going to take several years, is underway. If we can just stabilize and focus on taking those to their logical conclusion, I think the rewards will be very present down the line. It's precisely because of a very murky global backdrop. It's precisely because India over the last year has been witnessing, like some other emerging markets, both internal pressures through slightly higher inflation and external pressures through a much larger current account deficit, to which you alluded, that this has to be the year to do 2 things. One is put a premium on macroeconomic stability, ensure that the fiscal deficit is met, and ensure that through that we reduce the current account. So I'm actually very happy that the Prime Minister did not, was not populist, and actually was, the subtext of his comments were, we're going to consolidate the gains we've made in the last few years. I'll make 2 points. I think it is worth saying that, and worth reminding everybody, because we have short memories in India, that compared to 2013 on a macro stability front, we're far advanced. We should never be confused with the Fragile Five. We have an institutionalized inflation targeting framework. Inflation today is 4% versus 10% then. The current account deficit was 5% then. It's going to be 3% at most this year. The joint fiscal deficit is low. So it's worth reminding, I think, where we need to focus next. And again, the discussion we had yesterday on underlying competitiveness. What we've seen in the last year is that underlying competitiveness has been badly impinged both on the export front and the import front. And that will need two things. One is that we'll need a gradually depreciating currency. When inflation is running at 5% and the world is at 2%, just to to stay in the same place, the currency needs to depreciate 2 or 3% a year. So we should not obsess about these numbers. But secondly, and I think this is really an agenda for the next administration, we need to focus on factor market reforms. We need land reform, labor reform, banking reform, because only then will that underlying current account stay sustainable for the longer run. So for me, the next decade has to be focused on factor market reforms. The last 2 decades have been focused on product market reforms.
Okay, that's the road ahead as far as reforms are concerned. The market would like to see factor market reforms. Ajay Srivastava, what to your mind would be the big takeaway that the markets will look for from the Prime Minister's speech this morning?
I think, first of all, the speech was what it's supposed to be. It was an election year speech by the Prime Minister, who has a tough election ahead of him. So I think the right things were said in the thing and addressed to the people, the general population, not necessarily to the economic policy, because there perhaps the record is a little bit patchy at this point of time, so there's not much to talk about. So I think to that extent, it was a balanced speech. It was a political speech, election year speech. I think stock market, by and large, I think is moving on with the global linkages, with what Sajid said, competitive economy. The only thing I disagree with him is global environment is as clear as water. You know, US is growing, the world is growing, everybody is growing, where US at 4% growth rate had never happened. So we are into a growth environment in the globals. Nothing is murky about it. It's very crystal clear.
Yeah, I think he's talking specifically about emerging markets. I think Sajid is talking specifically about emerging markets because of the monetary accommodation withdrawal that we're seeing and the impact of that on emerging markets. I think that was the point that Sajid was making.
Yeah, but even if you extrapolate it, that when the global trade is growing, the emerging market is supposed to grow. And more important, in a scenario where China is under a cosh by the United States of America, which gives a tremendous opportunity to us as Indians on the sideline. We are so small in global trade. We should be doing a lot more better on exports. I think that's a critical thing we should have been talking about, is why we're not doing exporting enough. And I think that's what's, when you look at from the stock market perspective, it's doing what the economy is doing. It's rewarding the big ticket companies. It's penalizing the small companies, reflecting the economic policy. And I think that's the biggest challenge. Two challenges I see for the economy is, one, what do you do with the mass of smaller companies who are not doing well? You saw the results in the last 72 hours, which have come out of most small companies, have been very, very disappointing. The number two is, what is unsaid on the table is the great economic divide of India. Look at the north versus south now. The entire universe of your startups is happening in south of India. The north, which has become a little bit, I would say, is going backward. You just name 4 groups in North India, and that's all about the North can talk about. And we are the highest population as a proportion. So I think two challenges we have as an economy very clearly is what do you do with the MSME and medium sector, and what do you do with the North-South divide, because North is lagging behind tremendously in this fight to the new economy.
Yeah, and I want to take that point across to Rupa, because I know that this is an issue that Rupa has been writing about as well. Rupa, the point that both Sajid as well as we just heard there on the exports and the imports being badly impinged, and that being an area of concern as well as an opportunity for reform and policy intervention. What is it that you believe we need to do at this point in time, and where do you find the disappointments?
Well, on the trade front, my biggest disappointment is the fact that the Modi government has single-handedly, in 2 years, reversed 2 decades of liberalization. And that is an area of concern for me because that's going to have cascading effects across various sectors. As far as export competitiveness is concerned, I mean, Several people are pointing to the fact that the rupee has been depreciating, so this is an opportunity for India to push Make in India and export and create jobs. The point is that Indian industry just has not been competitive enough to, on the world stage. In fact, a study that came out last year by a rating agency, CRISIL, pointed out to the fact that export competitiveness is now at a decade low. There are structural problems at play here. Until and unless the government resolves those structural problems, so the problems relate to land and labor, factor market reforms that are hanging fire, the ones that I mentioned earlier in the segment, we're not going to make much progress. And so just simply raising import duties on a range of different goods is not a reform. It is not going to solve the underlying structural problems plaguing Indian industry.
Well, I think there's consensus on our panel there on the underlying weakness when it comes to competitiveness, and the depreciating rupee by itself may not be the panacea to push export growth. But let me bring in Avik Saha. Avik, a lot of the Prime Minister's speech was focused on addressing farmers and that constituency, of course, talking about the MSP. But let's look at the numbers. And this is, you know, my conversation with Ashok Gulati and you as well in the past, and of course in your writings. And Mr. Gulati is saying that the average annual increase in MSP has been the lowest, with the exception of the ragi crop, during the tenure of this government. In fact, if you talk about MSP, then market prices of most kharif crops are below the announced MSP as well. And of course, that pitch on doubling farm income by 2022, the difference between reality and aspiration, Avika, what did you make of the announcements today, or the reiterations today, actually?
Shireen, an Independence Day speech by any Prime Minister is a celebratory speech, and you know, the nation comes together and we celebrate the most important day in our nationhood. The government announces certain policies in an election year, especially as this one. There were expectations for announcement. But so far as the farmers were concerned, the most important announcement was about a month ago, in the first week of July, with the MSP. And we were not, frankly, expecting anything very big on farmers' front. If you focus on the Prime Minister's fulcrums, the hooks on which the speech depended, it was reform, perform, and transform. On the reform front, it's the government's job to bring in whatever reform it thinks is necessary. Performance is something that you and I and all citizens will judge the government by, and transform is something that the historians will write about. On the performance front on farmers, the government has fallen short. If you just take one part on MSP, the Prime Minister said that it was pending for years. He forgot to mention that it was pending with him for 4 years also. And on an election year, there have been announcements, very grand announcements. I agree with Mr. Gulati that they are short if you compare the 5-year UPA, last 5 years of UPA and this government. The hike is also not what it is touted to be. But nevertheless, it's not so much the hike, it's implementation, it's that perform. I want to stress on the word perform. And just after the announcement, if you remember, the first announcement of MSP was actually in February, on 1st of February, the budget. And there was a 3-month marketing season after that. And no farmer in India got a MSP for any of our winter Rabi crops. So I don't see any change. And if you see the MSP announcement, the press release, it says that the same NABARD, the same NAFED, the same FCI are going to run the procurement and the farmers will get MSP. So it's a kind of a fairy tale situation here for the farmers and the farming lobby. And overall, this doubling of income by 2022 is not sounding right anymore. It's very trite and it's almost unbelievable. And I think the Prime Minister has not been able to address the farmers' concerns adequately. But then, time will tell if he has or he hasn't. Overall, well, he repeated, as you rightly said, many of the things that have been spoken of before. And many of those things have not really come to bear. So, nothing much to really talk about.
Okay, so as you pointed out, and I think that's essential, the focus is now going to be on perform. As Sajid was also alluding to, it is now time for execution, implementation, whether it is the farm-related schemes announced, it's the GST, it's the IBC, or in fact schemes like the health assurance program that will now be rolled out on the 25th. Let me get wrap-up comments from each of you then. And Sajid, let me start by asking you, you talked about some of the areas of vulnerability that the government needs to focus on. This is now an election year. It's very clear that the general elections cannot be advanced to December. We've had the Chief Election Commissioner tell us that very categorically yesterday, and also stating very clearly that you cannot do simultaneous polls without constitutional amendments. Given that picture and given where the macros stack up, what is it that you will be watching out for, Sajid?
Just for policymakers to go back to first principles, I think what we've learned in the last 20 years in emerging markets is once the initial panic settles down, investors are very good between discriminating amongst emerging markets, and our fundamentals are still very strong. I think what we need to do is go back to first principles, ensure that inflation remains in the band that the RBI has, which the RBI has underscored in the last two meetings, and that's brought some confidence to markets. Ensure that the center keeps its fiscal deficit this year. I think that's critical, given that there's less control over where state finances are. And I think, and ensure that you engineer this calibrated rupee depreciation, which over the next couple of quarters should begin to help compress the current account. If we go back to first principles and just do no, the Hippocratic oath, do no harm, we should be able to, come out of the situation relatively unscathed.
Well, do no harm is the hope at this point in time. Ajay, final comments from you on what the expectation is as we gear up for Battle 2019.
I think the only expectation is that let the business do the work of business. Let's not get into the business start of it. Let's not put more compliance burden on the companies. Let us do the right things. And I think for a change, institutions are working. You saw the SEBI regulation on Kotak Bank, which came yesterday. Fantastic. RBI governor is now independent stance. I think we should just let the institutions work and the economy start to function. I think that's the best thing which can happen in an election year. And most likely the attention will be elsewhere. So we should be comfortable and dealing with the world as the real world is.
Okay, so deliver on the promise of maximum governance and minimum government. Rupa, final words from you.
Shireen, what I would be looking for is the fiscal slippage, because Ayushman Bharat is not going to be cheap. So I'm going to be watching for that. I would also like the government to ensure that the GST continues to be tweaked to make it more efficient. So stop tinkering with rates, start listening to exporters' concerns. Many of them have been languishing because their refunds have not reached them yet. These are some of the issues that I'm going to be looking at, and more importantly, I'm going to be looking for reforms. What is Mr. Modi's agenda going to be in 2019 if he comes back big? Are they going to push hard on social welfare, or are they going to push more towards reforms? I'm just reminded 5 years ago we were all enthralled by the Bhagwati Sen debate, and everybody thought that Modi would be more on Mr. Bhagwati's side of economic policy making, but it turns out Sen has actually won hands down, ironically in a right-of-center government.
All right, so the Sen camp winning the battle as far as the economic agenda is concerned. That's Rupa's take. But Shobhana Kamineni, outside of insurance, what is corporate India going to be watching out for? Business confidence has picked up. IIP numbers seem to suggest, while there is a base effect that's playing out there as well, that there is a revival. But taking revival to resurgence, what is it that it will take?
I like what Ajay said, that today's speech was actually a clarion call of what the election is going to be about. And let's not take anything away from our Prime Minister. He's really worked hard the last 4 years. Definitely change has come, and we're on that path. And let politics move towards that. What business is looking for is that we want the government to listen to us, and I think that slowly that's been happening. that change has been happening because companies now are actually geared. We're lean, and I think that we know how to run our business and how to work in the world. So if the government can just work little be more cooperative and let us move forward, just like Ajay said, I think that business will do well. And this country will continue to move forward. On the whole, today, August 15th, I think that I'm more hopeful that we will move forward to a better India. Some of those big ticket is there, but let's not be cynical. We should take away that sure. There's a happiness quotient and a confidence quotient today among all Indians.
Well, we need to build on that confidence quotient and ensure that we continue to track the momentum that we have been able to achieve. But as our panelists pointed out, there are some vulnerabilities that we need to focus on, and of course policy intervention as and when is appropriate, given the fact that it's an election year. Unlikely that we are going to see any of the big ticket factor market reforms that Rupa as well as Sajid spoke of, and perhaps as Shobna and Ajay pointed out, let the business do its business and let the government focus on politics. Avik Saha, Ajay Srivastava, Sajid Chinoy, Rupa Subramania and Shobha Kamineni. Appreciate you joining us here on the CNBC-TV18 special. Politics will be taken forward by my colleague Parikshit Luthra right after this short break.